Well then, let's address this.
That's the thing. He's white.
I can follow you like a dog to the end of the world.
He's white? Our friendship is built on our mutual distrust of England.
Please, sir. Can I have some more?
Hi, I'm LadyJenevia, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. My primary thing that I do on here is I review films, and nowadays only once in a while will I also cover television. To me, the cinema is a sacred space and the ultimate way to experience the art form, but for the last year I've also been doing source material videos where I read a book that's going to be adapted, I do a video talking about that source material, and I offer some early thoughts about how to go about adapting that. It's an opportunity for me to study the mechanics of the adaptation process from print into the film medium, but every time I do one of these, it's also an excuse for me to promote libraries. If you don't already have a library card, you should go get one, because even if you're not going to use it very often, getting a library card helps libraries with their funding. Library cards are free, and once you have one, not only can you access books for free, you can also check out physical media that they have in their collections, DVDs and whatnot. And you can also virtually check out things to watch through the online libraries that are linked to your library card. Most recently, I watched the documentary I, Dolores online through my library card. And currently, I'm also reading this book by Irish journalist Ed Maloney, which I had to submit a request for so that they could request it to be borrowed from a different library since they didn't carry it in their own collections. You see, libraries are for the people. And every source material video I've done this year has been accomplished by checking out that book from the library. Some source material videos I already have published on my channel for upcoming films include Regretting You, which releases in October, The Running Man, which releases in November, The Housemaid, which releases in December, People We Meet on Vacation, which releases in January, and most recently I did Reminders of Him, which was originally supposed to release in February, but they have now moved that to March, so as to not compete with Wuthering Heights, which is what we will be talking about today. What I want to try to do is take things in a somewhat sequential order, so we will begin by giving an overview of the book and go through some of the main issues that have arisen in the discourse around this latest adaptation, and then we will land on what little we've seen of the film thus far. At the time of recording this video, we only have a teaser, not a complete full trailer. Wuthering Heights is the one and only novel by Emily Brontë. Originally published in 1847 to mixed reviews, the novel is now regarded as a classic. I'm going to issue a full spoiler warning for the Wuthering Heights plot, as well as Emerald Fennell's two previous films, Promising Young Woman and Saltburn. We are first and foremost talking about Wuthering Heights, but if we're going to expand the conversation to include the various bits of dramatic discourse surrounding this latest adaptation, which is directed by Emerald Fennell, it's inevitable that we're going to mention a few things here and there about her prior works. You've now been warned, so let's go through an overview of the Wuthering Heights story as it was originally told by Emily Brontë. Now, normally I would be a lot more detailed in presenting a plot breakdown in a source material video, but because we have a lot of other facets to cover, I'm going to consolidate the material a lot more than I usually would. Wuthering Heights is in the public domain, so it's incredibly easy to find a copy of it to read, not only through your local library, but also if you just search for the book online. It is published on many different websites. The story has often been misrepresented as being about just these two characters, Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff, being in love, this sort of doomed love story, but that's really not what the story is about. Heathcliff is adopted by the patriarch of the Earnshaw family. We will just call him Mr. Earnshaw. He goes off on a trip to Liverpool and comes back with Heathcliff, thus adopting him into the family. And for whatever reasons, he heavily favors Heathcliff. His own son, Hindley, is violent and hateful towards Heathcliff from the time that he meets him until decades afterwards when Hindley dies. Heathcliff is not white. He's never been white. Emily Brontë's ghost herself would tell you that he's not white. In regards to the book's timeline, the story is not told in chronological order. We first meet a man named Mr. Lockwood, who is the new tenant of Thrushcross Grange. Heathcliff is the owner/landlord of both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Wuthering Heights is where Heathcliff grew up with the Earnshaws. Also, to be clear, Heathcliff is the name that he was given when he was adopted into that family, but he was never given the Earnshaw name. He was given the name Heathcliff as his one and only name. First name, surname, it's just Heathcliff. At this time that we're introduced to all of this, Heathcliff also has Kathy Linton and Hareton Earnshaw staying at Wuthering Heights against their will, but we will get to that. So we have the Earnshaws and we have the Lintons. Catherine Earnshaw married Edgar Linton, and together they had Kathy Linton, who was also named Catherine after her mother, who died shortly after giving birth to her. Heathcliff refers to Catherine, the woman he's in love with / obsessed with, as Kathy, but in order to keep you, who are watching this video, from being confused, I will only refer to Catherine Earnshaw as Catherine and her daughter as Kathy, just so that you will be able to know which one I'm speaking about. Lockwood is told this entire messy, dramatic story of how Heathcliff became the unfriendly landlord he knows in the present day by Nellie, who is the main housekeeper of the place. She grew up with all of the main players in the Earnshaw household, as she's in a similar age range as both Catherine and Heathcliff. The age difference between Catherine and her older brother Hindley is, I believe, somewhere around 8 years, and Heathcliff is said to be of a similar age or maybe just slightly older than Catherine. Nellie's mother worked in the Earnshaw household, so even as a child, Nellie was helping out with some of the chores, and she grew into being a servant who worked at that household as well. This does mean, as is often the case with the books, that the perspective of the story is limited to the subjective experience of its narrator. If Nellie was not present to see something, she can only be told about what happened by the other characters in the story. A film is not obligated to stick to just one character's perspective unless you're doing a specific narrative style that commits to that for whatever purpose of the people making the film. A recent example of that would be Zach Cregger's Weapons. Heathcliff, I will remind you, is not white, and Lockwood is the first person to describe his appearance, and it's made very clear from the beginning that he's not white. They're never specific in the book about claiming a specific country of origin or ethnic background, but multiple characters will call him the G word, although it's spelled differently than how we would normally see that word spelled today. In Bronte's novel, it's spelled with a G-I instead of G-Y. You will also get some other speculations about where his origins might be from, and when he's first brought to Wuthering Heights as a child, they mention how whatever he's saying is something that cannot be understood, so my guess would be that he is speaking a different language than English. You will see speculations and literary analyses that he's Romani or that he's black, but most adaptations of the book that have been made in the Imperial Court have had white actors playing him. This goes completely against what the text makes extremely clear. This is not merely a superficial description that holds no meaning or significance in the story. The cruel treatment that Heathcliff receives is what pushes and morphs him into being this vengeful, cruel, monstrous man. When Mr. Earnshaw dies, Hindley becomes the head of the household, and he stops Heathcliff from being able to continue his formal education, and Hindley forces Heathcliff to do hard labor as a servant. Even before Mr. Earnshaw passed away, there was a point in childhood where Hindley was fighting Heathcliff for the umpteenth time, and he called him the G-word and an imp of Satan. Heathcliff and Catherine are quite close, and it's definitely the type of closeness that in another world would have led to a marriage of both of their choosing, but things don't go that way, because Emily Brontë said, no, it's not that type of story. One day, when she and Heathcliff are playing together, they go spy on the Lintons, who are the family at Thrushcross Grange, and one of their dogs bites Catherine, thus alerting the family to their presence, and the Lintons are so white.
He only circles white people, and I've told him when it comes to finding you a husband, we can't afford to be racist.
The Linton family are consistently described as being blonde and fair-skinned, and they unleash a tidal wave of not microaggressions, but any and every rude thing they could say about Heathcliff, they say it. G-word, comparing him to a robber, a gang, a thief, the entire family gets in on this, and I wish them nothing but the worst. Catherine stays at the Lintons to recover from her dog bite. Weird, but okay.
White people.
She and Edgar start to grow close, and to put things mildly, this hurts Heathcliff's feelings. He says to Nellie that he wishes he had lighter hair and skin when talking about how he feels inadequate in being able to pursue Catherine according to the social customs of the world and time that this story takes place in. So yes, the fact that he's not white is in fact a major component of who he is and the journey we follow that covers the majority of his life. Him being adopted as a child under the age of 10 years old, that would be my best guess, all the way to his death at the age of somewhere around 40-something years old. Now, Heathcliff wants to be with Catherine, but in the most typical bad timing of occasions, Catherine is telling Nellie that she's going to marry Edgar, who had proposed to her, and she says that all of this is Hindley's fault for lowering Heathcliff's station so much that now it would degrade her to marry him. So, of course, Heathcliff only overhears that part of the conversation and he walks off right then, so he doesn't hear what comes after, which is her espousing these grand romantic feelings that she has for him. Now, before I proceed further into the plot, I do need to make it clear that Catherine is not some demure lady. She has a temper, she can be cruel, manipulative, she's even physically abusive in one of her encounters with Nellie. There are little to no main characters in this story that are anything less than insufferable. They're at best annoying, and at worst, horrifically abusive, and it's an enormous relief when those people inevitably have a dirt nap. There is no one to root for, no one to really invest in, so if you're asking yourself, well then what's the point of reading this? Well, for starters, you have to put this in the context of when and where this was written and published. For an English woman in the 1800s to put forth a story that is loudly exposing the cruelty people can and do inflict on one another, and show how all-consuming that is, and how it festers and spreads from one generation to the next, like this poisonous virus, it definitely makes a big impression. Not to mention the anti-racism. But as for the broad, shocking abuse and cruelty, nowadays you have an entire AO3 tag designated to warning readers, hey, this story's going to be dark and demented, so if you enter this space, that's what you're signing up for. So it wouldn't necessarily be shocking in the same way if a new writer were to write about what is in this book and have it published in 2025 or 2026 when this film is going to be released in cinemas. We would be making flippant comments about how men will do everything except go to therapy. We'd be talking about generational trauma. We would be talking about the proven negative consequences of corporal punishment, and so on and so forth. This book is very violent. People are physically violent. Adult Heathcliff is cruel to animals, and his son Linton copies that behavior. Don't think that I missed that line about the cats. I am a doting parent of a disabled cat, and if I have to read that type of cruelty in source material, well, I will admit it automatically lowers my impression of the overall reading experience. I was very clear about how much disdain I had for the caught stealing book when I did a source material video on that, because there was this really long graphic description of something very awful being done to a cat.
Nah, yo, hold my poodle. Hold my poodle. Hey, yo, what's up? Y'all got a problem?
Nothing to that extent happens in Wuthering Heights. The animal stuff is more so mentioned in passing. It's not the main focus of whatever is being talked about in those scenes. Heathcliff ran away as soon as he heard Catherine say that it would degrade her to marry him. And she's so upset about him disappearing that she goes stumbling around in the rain and ends up sick for ages. Honestly, the amount of times people get slightly exposed to weather, someone has a window open, and then they're just sick for ages. How did the English manage to stay physically alive long enough to wreak as much colonial violence as they did?
So I don't know what else to say. Should I sing a rebel song?
But anyway, Heathcliff returns after 3 years, and at that point, Edgar and Catherine are married. It's dramatic and messy, and I'm so genuinely baffled that people have manipulated this book into being repeatedly sold as a romance, because the toxicity of Catherine and Heathcliff's relationship, it's unpleasant to follow. Have any of you ever seen Jeux d'Enfants? I don't think that's too esoteric of a reference, but if you feel as ignited as I become to start throwing hits when you hear the phrase cap ou pas cap, you will understand how it feels for me to go back and reread Wuthering Heights after however many years since I last read it.
Allez, réussis ton concours. Cap ou pas cap?
Julien,
Dis alors, cap ou pas cap? Oh my god, I'm gonna hang myself by the janimals if you don't stop talking.
Think about the most annoying, toxic, on-again, off-again teenage couple you've ever known or currently know. That's Catherine and Heathcliff. Because you also have to remember that Catherine dies when she's somewhere around the age of either being in her late teens or perhaps her early 20s. And either way, that's pre-development of the frontal lobe of her brain, and it shows in all of her behavior. So when Heathcliff returns, he's become wealthy and he's dressed like a gentleman, and they don't give you a real explanation of how he got this money, but there's definitely an insinuation that it would involve some sort of immoral element to it because of the ways he goes about asserting power and force and manipulation into getting even more money and ownership of things and people after he's returned. He and Catherine are immediately close again, but he also eventually lashes out at her and declares that he's going to have his revenge because he's upset that she didn't just pursue something with him instead of marrying Edgar. Edgar's younger sister, Isabella, quickly becomes infatuated with Heathcliff when he returns, and Catherine advises her against this. She says that you don't know him like I do. He's not a nice person. I'm paraphrasing here, but also because it's Catherine, she's not particularly kind or delicate in her delivery, so this conversation really upsets Isabella because she's also a naive young teenager who doesn't know what the hell she's talking about. And there's this really dire scene where Catherine declares out loud that Isabella is interested in Heathcliff when he's right there in the room with them. And she's mocking Isabella, and Heathcliff is very dismissive of Isabella's interest in him, not surprising to us since we know that he only has eyes for Catherine. And Isabella gets really upset by this because she's embarrassed, and she's being rejected by someone she's naively decided she's interested in. So that's one layer of the cruelty. But if that weren't enough, you also hear Heathcliff mention to Catherine about how Isabella is Edgar's heir. So you immediately know that it has clicked in his mind that one of the ways he can enact his vengeance is to pursue Isabella, because then the inheritance of money and property, namely Thrushcross Grange, would go from Edgar to Isabella to Heathcliff if they were to get married, which they eventually do. Now, in a preliminary skim of various pieces published about the various adaptations of Wuthering Heights, it seems to be a common practice that these so-called adaptations will just entirely cut off and remove the second half of the story. Catherine dies about halfway through the book. Do I think that Margot Robbie would produce and presumably be involved in the development for a film in which she's only going to stick around for about half the runtime with the occasional ghostly appearance to haunt Heathcliff for the second half of the film's runtime? I would guess no, but that's just a guess. I haven't seen it yet. But since I'm making an educated guess that they will either entirely omit or speed run through the second half of the book, in which Heathcliff is tormenting his wife, his son Linton, Hindley's son Hareton, and Catherine's daughter, Cathy, I'm going to summarize those things even more than I did the first half. Heathcliff forces his son Linton to court Cathy, and Heathcliff also eventually holds Cathy and Nellie hostage at Wuthering Heights in order to force Cathy to marry Linton, who dies not long after their marriage. But legality, paperwork, oppressive legislation, and so on and so forth, Heathcliff is able to acquire ownership of Thrushcross Grange, in addition to Wuthering Heights, which he had already gotten a hold of because Hindley had a very bad drinking and gambling problem. The alcoholism mostly flared up after his wife Frances died. Frances is a blink and you'll miss her type of character. She's only really around in the story long enough to give birth to their son Hareton. After Hindley died, Heathcliff forced Hareton to work hard labor as a servant of the household, and he and this cantankerous older servant named Joseph basically encourage all of the worst qualities Hareton could have. They don't allow him to learn to read or receive other formal education. They encourage him to swear and speak improperly, and they just don't really guide him to behave in any sort of gentlemanlike manner. That being said, there is a small sort of character development for Hareton and Cathy where she learns to stop lashing out and being cruel to him about his inability to read, and he learns to not lash out and hit her when she's being a brat. Now, that only happened once, but That's a vile thing to do, and he needs to not be continuing that behavior once he and Kathy become cousin spouses. I mean, what's a girl to do in Yorkshire when she has no friends and no social life in this story except the creepy house of horrors down the road where her mother's vengeful, not quite an ex lives and is playing puppet master with her life? Marry your first cousin husband when you're being held hostage and forced to do so. And then you marry your other cousin husband once Heathcliff dies after he was being increasingly haunted by Catherine's ghost. It's a lot more violent, physically, emotionally, and psychologically than my snarky summary may be coming across, but I do want to mention a bit about the supernatural element because that will be brought up again in my discussion of the adaptation. At the very beginning of the book, when you're meeting Lockwood, the character whom we hardly ever seem to meet in various on-screen adaptations, the new tenant of Thrushcross Grange, he has to stay at Wuthering Heights for the night because it got far too dark too quickly and he just does not know how to walk back to Thrushcross Grange in the dark because he just moved in. So yes, he's going to stay the night at Wuthering Heights. Little does he know that the servant put him in Catherine's old room, and he dreams that he is visited by Catherine's ghost, who demands to be let in through the window. Henry! When Catherine died, Heathcliff got so angry and devastated that he demands out loud that Catherine needs to haunt him. He doesn't want them to be separated. And this obsession lasts for decades, so that even when Edgar Linton, her husband, has died and been buried next to her, Heathcliff orders digging to be done so he can look at her corpse again and have the side panel of her coffin removed so that when he, Heathcliff, will eventually die, he can be buried next to her and they won't have those coffin panels or walls on the side to separate them. After he dies, some of the locals claim to have seen the ghosts of Heathcliff and Catherine walking around the area.
Fallen.
I know how difficult it must be for you to overcome all those years of upper middle class suburban oppression. Must be tough.
This new film adaptation has had a multitude of controversies and discourse flare-ups from more or less the very beginning of its announcement. I will touch on a few of those in order to contextualize a bit about what they are, but also offer some of my opinions here and there. For the most part, I don't really care about trying to convert anyone to have opinions about this film that are identical to mine. If you don't feel like this film is something you're interested in or that it's going to appeal to you, then you should find whatever films are well suited to match what you are interested in seeing. I have a monthly movie pass, so I'm at the cinema more or less every week, and I review films here on YouTube, so my criteria for what I will go see versus what I refuse to see altogether is not going to be the same as the median of today's moviegoers who are paying every time they buy a new movie ticket. I do, however, feel strongly that the cinema is an important institution that people should support more than they currently are. So if nothing else, I hope that I can convince you to maybe go just slightly more than you currently do. If you only go to the cinema once every other month, maybe consider going once a month. There are a lot of fantastic films being released if you know how to find the ones that align with your specific interests. And I feel very strongly that the direct-to-streaming model has been highly detrimental to the entertainment industry as a whole, to the artistic process, to the ability of artists and workers who help to create the things we enjoy watching to be able to make a livable wage. So as much as we can, supporting the cinema and supporting physical media is important to do. And following that point, regardless of what else I might say about this adaptation, I am entirely obliged to give Emerald Fennell, Margot Robbie full credit for rejecting the more financially lucrative offer in favor of a deal that would ensure that their film would have a theatrical release in cinemas instead of simply being dumped out onto a direct-to-streaming platform. In this piece, published on World of Real, which I will link in the pinned comment along with any other references I'm going to use in this video, we read how they passed on a $150 million offer from Netflix to acquire Wuthering Heights. Instead, they took an offer from Warner Brothers Pictures. Fennell and Robbie were adamant in giving Wuthering Heights a robust theatrical rollout. It's been reported that they left close to $80 million on the table by refusing the Netflix offer. It turns out that the whole ordeal left Netflix totally bewildered by what had just occurred. A report from Variety has a top agent saying that Netflix was shocked by Fennell's Netflix snub because obviously they had outbid every other studio for so long and had been used to winning these contests. Netflix wasn't even the runner-up in the bidding contest to acquire Wuthering. Amazon is believed to have barely missed out in nabbing Fennell's film as, much like Warner Brothers, they had promised Fennell a major theatrical push. Warner's won out by offering $70 million to distribute the film. Netflix has the biggest number of subscribers and scale, so they can afford to play the game that they're playing, says Eric Handler, an analyst at Roth Capital Partners. But there's a growing contingent of directors and movie stars who are saying no thanks. Fennell and Robbie's Netflix snub could turn out to be an earth-shaking moment in the industry. Just look at what's happened since the snub. Greta Gerwig has seemingly convinced Netflix to release her Narnia theatrically in IMAX, and Daniel Craig is now pushing hard for next year's Knives Out 3 to get the same treatment. Now, this piece I've just read from was published in November of 2024, so my understanding is that Wake Up Dead Man is going to do what Glass Onion did, which is the previous Benoit Blanc whodunit. That entails a 1-week release in the cinema about a month before the wide release on Netflix. If you are one of my regular viewers, you know I love those films. I've talked about them quite a bit on my channel. But I know that Daniel Craig has also made headlines before for being very open and frank about his disdain for the way that these corporate higher-ups in streaming companies behave and conduct themselves about not believing that the theatrical release is important. I will try to find a source for that and include it in the pinned comment. But all of this is to say that even if I end up disliking more or less everything about this new Wuthering Heights film, my genuine hope is that it will help to set an example to even more filmmakers, especially the ones with enough name recognition to have the luxury of options, to stand their ground in advocating for the cinema. And by extension, hopefully more film fans will continue to advocate for the cinema and try to reach the everyday moviegoers into also supporting the cinema. Now, this distribution announcement came in November, but the general project and main casting announcement came 2 months prior in September, where folks who keep up with movie announcements learned that there would be a Wuthering Heights movie, directed, written, and produced by Emerald Fennell, with Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi starring in it. They also included the fact that Lucky Chap would be producing the film. For anyone that's either predominantly or entirely book-oriented, Lucky Chap is a production company co-founded by Margot Robbie and her husband, along with a couple of other folks. That company produced both Promising Young Woman and Saltburn, which were Emerald Fennell's first 2 feature films that she directed, with Wuthering Heights now being the third. Lucky Chap has produced a lot of the films that Margot Robbie has starred in from the time that Lucky Chap was founded. My favorite, of course, would be Birds of Prey.
Run, Piggy, run!
Loved every moment. The kind of movie that makes you want to punch a cop. Whoa.
But it's also produced other films which she has not appeared in. My favorite of those would have to be Megan Park's film from last year. That was one of the films in my honorable mentions for the entire year. I knew that film was going to be a problem right from the beginning when they dropped Nelly Furtado's Say It Right on the boat ride.
Fabulous.
Now, I have stopped using Twitter because the less scroll time I give these deranged big tech losers, the better off the world is.
It's just I wish I had more time to seek out the dark forces and join their hellish crusade.
But in doing a quick skim online of discourse about Wuthering Heights 2026, some folks are upset about Margot Robbie's age and her hair color. Catherine in the book is a brunette, and she's either a child or a teenager for the vast majority of what we follow in her story. To begin, the age issue. I don't really care about Margot being in her mid-30s. The life expectancy of this time period is shorter, and ageism against women is very rampant, especially towards women in the entertainment industry. Julia Sawalha was about a decade older than Lydia Bennett was in the book when she was playing her in the superior Pride and Prejudice adaptation, which is the 1995 series. Everyone in that cast is hilarious in their role, and I love a comedy queen. When she said she wants to go to Brighton, that sure sounded like a whiny teenager to me. I don't care if she's not one in real life.
Oh,
Now, I'm not saying that you're never allowed to be upset about inaccurate casting, but in this case, I just don't care about her age. If you make these characters played by teenage actors for the majority of Catherine and Heathcliff's relationship timeline, there's definitely more of a sense of the immaturity of these characters being intertwined with their age. But if you make these characters played by adult actors who look like adults, which both of these people absolutely do, then there's a conversation to be had about how even into adulthood, people are unable to let go of grievances of their past, work through their traumas, and instead they continue to enact terrible cruelty onto one another. So hypothetically, if you are maintaining the themes of the story, I don't care about aging the characters up a bit. It really makes little difference to me. But then we get to the caucasity in the room, which is Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff.
White people.
A quick reminder for anyone who didn't already know this. The vast majority of English language adaptations of Wuthering Heights have cast white actors to play Heathcliff. So this is in no way the one and only adaptation to lambast for doing this. That being said, the general consensus online seems to be that it's the 2020s now. You should know better than to continue doing that. There may very well be some folks who need no other reason to skip watching this at the cinema than the fact that they continue this whitewashing, and that's perfectly valid. I want more people to go to the cinema, but I do not need you to see this specific film. You have lots of options. Maggie Gyllenhaal's The Bride is releasing in cinemas March 6th, and I will be seated opening weekend to see the iridescent Jessie Buckley devouring that role. That was originally listed as a 2025 release. I've had that on my Letterboxd watch list for ages now. Hurry up. Let me see it.
What's my name? I can't remember.
Oh, right. There is so much evidence in Wuthering Heights that Heathcliff isn't white, and it's a major component of how he's treated, the type of person he becomes, because of all of this trauma of being degraded because of his ethnicity. There's no discussion to be had about whether or not this is the case. You don't get to act oblivious about who he is. You chose to make this film and made a conscious decision that you simply do not care about telling a story that is true to what Emily Brontë wrote about this character, which is that he's not white. Even the Brontë Parsonage Museum has an entire page going in depth about the fact that although Brontë doesn't fully commit to saying exactly what type of person of color he is definitely not white. And they put the novel into the historical context of Emily Bronte's life, the abolitionists that the Brontë family knew, the historical context of the transatlantic slave trade using the port in Liverpool during the time period in which Mr. Earnshaw visited there and found Heathcliff on the streets, and also the fact that Emily Brontë chose to set her book farther back in time from when she was writing it. Specifically, they said on their website, although the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in 1807, enslavement in America existed throughout Emily Bronte's life and was not abolished until 17 years after her death. Questions around enslavement and abolition were at the forefront of British politics. The Brontes would have read about this in newspapers. We know they subscribed to the Leeds Mercury, quoted previously. It's interesting that Emily chose to set Wuthering Heights in a time when the transatlantic slave trade was a large part of the economy in Britain. With all of that in mind, there's no other conclusion I can come to other than the people who are making this film simply do not care about the truth of Heathcliff's story, and I don't find it to be a surprising choice on the part of the people that are making this, because when I look through Lucky Chap's output of the films I've seen of theirs, including the ones that I have enjoyed and own on physical media, none of them were about this type of subject matter. And when it comes to Emerald Fennell's films, Promising Young Woman is a story in which a woman named Cassie goes on a revenge quest against the people who either committed or helped to cover up the rape of her best friend, Nina, who eventually took her own life, and it ends with Cassie being murdered by Nina's rape. But apparently, the audience is supposed to be perfectly fine with the ending because the police have been informed about all of this. As if the police can be trusted to prosecute perpetrators of violence against women. Police are there to protect the private property of the bourgeoisie and enforce the status quo. Who else but a generationally wealthy person would think that that is a nice ending to a story about that subject matter? Emerald Fennell's father, if you visit his website, you could get yourself a brand new ring for the price of £12,750. That converts to over 17,000 US dollars, over 26,000 Australian dollars, and over 14,000 euros. If you give me a lump sum of £12,750, I'm not buying a ring. I'm getting a second cat. Just kidding. I just got a second cat anyway, and I still don't have that much disposable income to afford any of these rings. But a cat is better than a piece of jewelry. Thank you. And as for Saltburn, that had nothing interesting to say in my estimations. I didn't find entertainment in this case of petulant infighting among one maniacal member of the petite bourgeoisie and an unbearable bourgeoisie family. If it was supposed to be offering me a tale about a man being driven mad by passion, I can find that concept elsewhere told in a more compelling way. Namely, Perfume, the story of a murderer. You want to see a freak skulking around and getting up to no good? Ben Whishaw as Jean-Baptiste Grenouille excelled at that assignment. And if you're watching this video and wondering why I would have any consideration to watching Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights if I don't rate her two previous films all that favorably, that is because, in addition to being interested in studying and discussing the adaptation process here on my channel, as I've done numerous times and continue to do, filmmakers are generally not fixed in one place. They can and usually do have peaks and valleys in their body of work if they are able to have the opportunity to make enough films in their career that allow film fans or scholars to study how they evolve or experiment across various projects of theirs. To give you another example of that, Osgood Perkins' previous two films before this year were Gretel and Hansel and Longlegs, and I was more lukewarm about both of those, but then I saw The Monkey earlier this year, and I really enjoyed that. It was far more comedic in tone, and also far more comedic than its source material, both of which I did cover here on my channel, and now I really look forward to seeing what his next film does. It's called Keeper. It stars Tatiana Maslany, and that is releasing in cinemas this November. There are some filmmakers or performers whom I might swear off completely if they continually prove themselves to be horrific in how they treat people, but if your worst crime is that you made one or two movies that I didn't enjoy that much, that's not enough for me to write you off completely. I'm still willing to give your art a chance. And being that Saltburn was about a bunch of people being horrible to one another and being obsessed with wanting to be in the upper class, you've got a main character that is obsessed with someone even after they've died. Those are similarities to Wuthering Heights.
I don't think any of us are nice. I just don't know anyone nice. Not really.
You have a weird energy.
But then we jump ahead to the Wuthering Heights casting director controversy. So some trades began to report on a couple of comments made by casting director Carmel Cochrane, which came from a Q&A session at Scotland's Sands Film Festival. I will tell you from the start that I've only seen transcribed quotes, and I couldn't find any videos of her comments, so that already makes me somewhat less interested in forming a strong opinion about what she said. In an article from Deadline, we read, "The casting vet said she is currently catching a lot of heat for her work on Fennell's forthcoming Wuthering Heights adaptation. Aussie natives Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi have been cast in the film's central roles. There was one Instagram comment that said the casting director should be shot," Cochrane said, "but just wait till you see it, and then you can decide whether you want to shoot me or not. But you really don't need to be accurate. It's just a book. That is not based on real life. It's all art." Further teasing Fennell's Wuthering Heights, Cochrane said, "There's definitely going to be some English lit fans that are not going to be happy," in reference to the film's artistic interpretation of the source material. "Wait until you see the set design, because that is even more shocking," Cochrane said, "and there may or may not be a dog collar in it." Now, the main thing I saw being honed in on was the comment, "It's just a book." The book in question being Wuthering Heights, which is a beloved literary classic by its fans. And this comment is only further exacerbated by the pre-existing upset people had about this continued whitewashing of the text. If this was some contemporary novel set and published in the 21st century of two people falling in love, and the casting director said that they didn't care about maintaining the physical appearance described in the book, presumably, in that hypothetical story, the person's ethnicity doesn't hold any weight on the journey that that character is going on of falling in love with the other lead character. One example of that, I recently did a source material video on Reminders of Him, because that also has a film adaptation coming out in the coming months. The male lead of that story, Ledger, is not described as a person of color, but in the film he's being played by Tyreek Withers, and no reasonable person is going to object to that unless they're a bigot. Ugh. Nothing in that character's story is dependent on his ethnicity. So the comment of this casting director is not out of place in a general sense, but because people were already upset about yet another whitewashed Heathcliff, that fire was already ablaze. And I do want to be fair to this casting director because, for one, it's not ultimately her decision who gets cast to play the lead roles of a movie like this with a higher profile director like Emerald Fennell. Not to mention, Jacob Elordi has worked with Emerald Fennell before on Saltburn, so the logical assumption would be that she was the one to choose him to play Heathcliff, which would mean it doesn't make sense to redirect any upset about yet another white Heathcliff towards this casting director. Also, if people take the time to look through this Deadline article, you can also read, Cochrane also gave the audience at Sands an insight into her unique casting process, which has often been praised as dynamic and diverse. The casting vet said she never lets her work be entirely dictated by a film script or a director's casting brief. She used the idea of a character's race to illustrate her process. If something is clearly written as white, for example, a script reads, she tied her blonde hair back, but there's no specific reason for it. I will just put people on tape, Cochrane said. And then it's almost like I dare someone to question why I've done it, and they don't. So then it just becomes normal. Years ago, I would get people saying, did you read the brief? And I'd say, yeah, and this is my interpretation of it, just like when you can read a book. What this communicates is that her philosophy to her job is already what we want casting directors to do. If you don't actually have to have a character be white, you don't need to default to that. Let other performers have the chance to be seen and considered for the part. And not only that, I was looking through her IMDb page to see what other films she's done casting for, and I saw multiple films on that list that I really admire. The First Omen, Chevalier, the somewhat recent Lady Chatterley's Lover that came out a couple of years ago, The Northman, just to name a few. So I'm not about to hold a grudge against her. If you do, that is entirely up to you. But remember that this video is not intended to sway you about this specific film. My priority for swaying you is to get you to support libraries and to go to the cinema, independent of whether or not you would like to watch Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights. Another thing that is probably being poked at and igniting upset feelings, albeit unintentionally, is this mention of English lit fans that are not going to be happy. Because if you just throw that line around, especially without the context of the entire article, it can come across as not having any regard for the source material. This got me thinking about the concept of modern literary adaptations, because it's something that I covered and talked about a lot in 2023 when I was posting quite a bit of coverage and expressing high anticipation for Anyone But You, specifically because it was a modern literary adaptation. I made a video about the film, and I put that in the context of modern literary adaptations and how we used to have so many of those, and I really want them to be brought back. And I still feel that way a couple of years on. And when it comes to this idea of Emerald Fennell doing her version of Wuthering Heights, I can't help but wonder if some of this upset maybe could have been lessened if this had been a modern literary adaptation, because there's a natural freedom that comes with taking a story and putting it a century or multiple centuries forward from its original setting. That one scene I mentioned earlier from the Wuthering Heights novel where Catherine is mocking and embarrassing Isabella Linton by exposing her romantic interest in Heathcliff right in front of him, and he's cold and callous and dismissing her interest, but you also see him have it click in his mind that, well, he could go after Isabella in order to try to make a move towards obtaining the Linton family inheritance. When I reread that scene, I was struck by how much it reminded me of Cruel Intentions. The association was probably a bit more easily formed in my mind, considering that the female lead of that film is also named Catherine, although the character was originally named Isabel in the novel that it's adapted from. Cruel Intentions is yet another modern literary adaptation. Thus, I couldn't help but think about how if Emerald Fennell had done a modern reimagining of Wuthering Heights, it wouldn't necessarily fix the long-standing upset people feel about the continued whitewashing of Heathcliff, but maybe it would have been easier for people to accept that there were going to be many differences from that source material. If I try to imagine what I think a modern literary adaptation of Wuthering Heights would look like that was written and directed by Emerald Fennell, I would assume that it would be an amalgamation of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, and Roger Crumble's Cruel Intentions, which I'm pretty sure she has already said on the record she's a fan of.
4 favorite films of all time: Cruel Intentions.
And when it comes to modern literary adaptations, even when they're very different from their source material, I know for a fact that you will find filmmakers who still have a lot of love of where those stories come from. A couple of years ago, I reached out and asked to cover a small independent film, and I specifically requested it because it was directed by Andy Fickman. For those of you who don't know, Andy Fickman directed She's the Man, which is a modern literary adaptation of William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. We did a virtual interview together, and after asking various questions about this new film, I asked him about She's the Man because I had already told him that I love that film, and for that reason I was very happy about being able to speak with him. I asked him why he thinks that film has the legacy it does and why people still love it as much as we do. And one of the things that he brought up was the fact that early on in making that film, they had the cast reading the original play and working on that. What stands out the most to you about why that film is so unique and why people still, after all these years, we love it as much as we do?
I think sometimes it's all about the perfect stew. I think we had an amazing cast that have all certainly continued and shown all of the various levels of their talent. We had amazing adult actors coming in. Our amazing Kiwi and Karen, who wrote the script, did such a brilliant job and have written so many other brilliant comedies. And Shakespeare, that guy kind of knew what he was doing. Whether it was a guy or a girl or whoever was Shakespeare, Shakespeare wrote a remarkable story that is so well crafted that all we had to do was do it. Matter of fact, when we first got to rehearsal in Vancouver, the first thing we did was focus on Twelfth Night. Everyone had that script. We watched Twelfth Night movies. We embraced Twelfth Night before we even started working on She's the Man.
I've mentioned Anyone But You in this video, and this was a modern literary adaptation of William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. I did the junket for that film, and I brought up the fact that it's a modern literary adaptation, and I asked the director, Will Gluck, about the film's numerous Easter eggs to the play or to Shakespeare in general, which I actually ended up making an entire video about, which Julia Cudney shouted out in one of her videos, which much appreciated, girl. And it was evident how much work Will Gluck put into studying that play inside and out, regardless of the fact that there were changes made to the story and the tone was very much stylized to invoke the irreverent whimsy of the early 2000s rom-coms. But there was once again a lot of care and consideration for where the story came from and maintaining certain key facets of the source material. Can you explain your process of curating and integrating these quotes into set decoration and character lines?
It was very hard. It felt like I was back in college or high school, because I had to find specific quotes from the play that worked where we were going. So I had to kind of reverse engineer it. So it was a lot. I swear to God, I must have reread this thing 50 times, the Shakespeare play during the editing of this movie, to find an actual quote and to see if an actual quote worked. And then once I thought I had a quote, I realized actually that's a kind of a misquote from the actual source material. So it took a lot of time to kind of pull. And you're probably the only one that's ever going to realize that the first line is not from Much Ado About Nothing. And you would also be kind of shocked to hear that over 70% of the people have no idea where those quotes are from.
Now, for anyone wondering why I'm going on a side tangent about modern literary adaptations when we've seen a teaser trailer that clearly shows this film is not set in present day, I think it's relevant to having a larger discussion about the variety of ways that classic literature can be adapted into the film medium. And regardless of some of the upset people have with what appear to be significant deviations from the source material, there is room to take creative liberties with the classics without coming across like you don't care about where the story came from, presuming that you even want to come across like someone who does admire the source material. Paul Verhoeven is very open about not caring whatsoever about being loyal to the source material for Starship Troopers. He did his own thing with the film, and that is perfectly fine with me because that movie is a banger.
Gotta stop mythologizing the police, for Christ's sake. Come on.
Now we are going to start talking about the promotional material released thus far, which offers a bit more of a concrete visual preview of what this film is than just a casting announcement of the leads. Some of the main differences, besides the whitewashing, which we've already talked about, are that this is a decidedly more anachronistic take on a period piece, and it's also heavily leaning into salacious eroticism, which is not at all reflective of what the original story was about. Before we go through some of those variables, I do want to mention that if you're looking for a film that's slightly later in time period, but it is set in the same location and it offers a similar concept as the book in regards to being a dark, tragic story with a doomed romance, cruelty within a family, and a touch of the paranormal. Remember I said I would come back to that. Let me recommend to you Emily, a film from a couple of years ago about Emily Brontë starring Emma Mackey, written and directed by Frances O'Connor, whom the English lit girlies might recognize for playing Fanny Price in the 1999 film adaptation of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. This film, Emily, was excellent. It has a similar tone to Wuthering Heights, so it may very well scratch some of the itches that are not being scratched by any number of Wuthering Heights film adaptations. I saw Emily when it was released in cinemas, and it was very well made. It was streaming recently on Tubi, but at the time of recording this video, I checked again on Letterboxd, and for viewers in the US, it's currently available to stream for free on both Hoopla and Canopy, so to all the library girlies, the time is now. But now on to this promotional material. Earlier on, we saw this promotional poster released, and that combined with the teaser's fixation on fingers going in or pressing on mouths is clearly attempting to convey eroticism, though I don't find that appealing in that regard whatsoever. It just made me think about brushing my cat's teeth. I have a disabled cat, her name is Kimiko, and I brush her teeth with this teeny tiny cat toothbrush, and I use Made for Cats toothpaste because it helps to keep her teeth and gums in good health. She does not like having her teeth brushed, so I have to use a finger to press on the side of her mouth to be able to push this toothbrush in and brush her teeth. The incessant fingers in or around mouths of these late 1700s English people, whom you know smelled crazy, doesn't really inspire eroticism for me. That's my truth. My subjective lived experience is that every time you have these Australians getting handsy with each other's mouths, I'm thinking about my cat's dental hygiene, which, by the way, I will have you know, I got great feedback on at her last vet appointment. You're trying to create salacious visuals, and I'm trying to lessen the likelihood of my cat requiring expensive dental work when she gets older. We haven't talked about any of the other casting, but Chau, who is Southeast Asian, is going to be playing Nellie, the housekeeper who narrates the majority of the story that we follow in the novel. And Shazad Latif, who is South Asian, is going to be playing Edgar Linton. Shazad's father is Pakistani. So in Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte's Heathcliff, who experienced and was heavily shaped by being treated cruelly for being a person of color, is now a white man. But people of color are welcome to be included in the story as the help and as the obstacle/non-endgame love interest to the main girl. No wonder Netflix wanted this movie.
No, not at all.
Flippant commentary aside, though, I do think that the task of adapting Wuthering Heights is not an easy one. If you did an exact copy-paste of the story from book to screen, and you kept it as cruel and mean as it was written, I think that there is probably a possibility that the uninitiated audience who hasn't read the book would not respond well to there being a majority white ensemble with one black or brown main character who spends half of the story being racially abused and mistreated, and then he becomes a cruel and vengeful monster who abuses multiple people within reaching distance of him. If you wanted to make that work, I think you would need to put a lot more nuance into his perspective. show all of the necessary empathy for what happens to him in the first half of the book. But following that, you would also have room to tell an interesting story that could resonate very well in today's world of investigating this pattern of behavior in people from marginalized groups who are willing to compromise their values and integrity in order to benefit from and rise up the ranks within an inherently oppressive status quo. Remember, Wuthering Heights is in the public domain, so if any of you watching this would like to write a screenplay of this, write that. On the film's IMDb page, they only identify Ewan Mitchell as whip-wielding man, and I'm assuming that he's only been added as such because he is visible in the teaser trailer, wielding one. But if I had to guess, of course, I would assume he's playing Hindley Earnshaw because this is very Hindley energy, and they already previewed the scars on Heathcliff's back. But saving what is undoubtedly my personal favorite casting for last, we have Alison Oliver as Isabella Linton. Now, why would Alison Oliver be my favorite casting of the bunch? Oh gee, I couldn't possibly put my finger on why exactly Irish actress Alison Oliver would be my favorite casting. Maybe because she's an alumni of School of Vera.
Did you go to School of Vera? Oh my god, up the hill, up in Sydney Hill.
Do you know who else went there? Sister George Michael herself, Siobhan McSweeney.
I go, Seal! Seal! She goes, who's Seal? I go, you. Isn't that your name? Seal Ban? She goes, wow! It's actually Siobhan. I said, wow!
Sadly, I am unable to come on this one as I despise the French.
The French! Viva Palestine! Up the IRA! Alright.
Imagine my surprise this year when I was watching The Wind That Shakes the Barley for the first time and she popped up. Little did I know that was her first film role. And what a way to begin your professional career. By the way, even if I poke fun here and there at the English, that's all just jokes and banter. The director of The Wind That Shakes the Barley, Ken Loach, he's English and he's iconic. I really need to find time to watch more of his films. But back to Miss Alison Oliver, there is a notable glimpse of her in the teaser where she appears to be forced to crawl, and I would assume that this is taking place after Heathcliff has married Isabella, and he's declared that since he cannot punish Edgar, whom he blames for Catherine falling ill, he announces to Isabella that he's going to be taking all of that out on her because he's abusive. Isn't that just like the English to try to keep a good Irish woman down?
Sure, I've my gun ready, Kathleen.
That's a knife.
You have to compensate, Kathleen. Times are hard.
It's very weird to observe that this has been cut into the teaser to suggest some sort of salacious, provocative thing, because I don't find domestic abuse to be provocative, and I don't know how that would be the conclusion one would come to upon reading the book.
I don't think any of us are nice. I just don't know anyone nice. Not really.
I had no idea.
One thing that caught my attention that I don't know if other people have addressed or not about this teaser is that there is almost no spoken dialogue in it. There are only a couple of words being spoken, mostly from Catherine and Heathcliff. And what I found most jarring is how unconvinced I was of their accents. They don't sound like they come from anywhere specific. They sound like what people think an English accent sounds like, without any knowledge of the fact that if you're in England, you travel 20 kilometers in any direction and you're going to encounter an entirely different accent. Even London has multiple accents, depending on which part you're in, and in all likelihood, the socioeconomic background of folks' upbringing tends to influence accents as well. If I had status as a producer on this project, I would insist that the people who are cast in the film have to do Yorkshire accents because it's set in Yorkshire. And there is, in fact, an explicit distinction in the way that dialogue is written in the book if the character is raised in a higher class or if they are working as servants. The dialogue of servants can actually be quite difficult to follow because, among other things, they tend to drop a lot of letters and they'll insert apostrophes to replace things. It feels like it's reminiscent of a version of this accent that in all likelihood doesn't exist anymore in this exact form because languages and accents evolve over time. But in order to make this make sense to a contemporary audience, I would simply use the Yorkshire accents of today and have the thicker accents be used for the servants and the more posh versions for the higher class characters. I went on this whole side quest of research when I was working on this video to try to ascertain whether or not there was a posh version of a Yorkshire accent. And what I found was that if you listen to the presenters on the show BBC Look North, the Yorkshire version, that would be the posh version of that accent. accent. So that is how the actors playing Catherine and the Lintons would be required to speak.
Hello there, good evening. You're watching Mondays Look North on the programme tonight.
I don't like when they make these so-called British stories and then the accents are generic. Specificity is essential to artistic design. We've had Christopher Eccleston talking about accent discrimination in the British industry. Jodie Comer has talked about receiving accent discrimination because she's a Liverpudlian. She will act circles around the actors who went to schools with the royals, I'll tell you that much, but you're classist and you're still judging her. Why would you do that? You've got Stephen Graham out here winning awards and representing for the folks in Kirby.
That kind of thing doesn't normally happen to a kid like me. I'm just a mixed race kid from a block of flats in a place called Kirby.
Kirby's right next to Yorkshire, by the way. And you've also got Jack O'Connell out here representing for both Ireland and Derby. Out me duck.
Oh, I'm from Derby.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm a visitor.
They're getting more accolades and recognition than ever. The rest of you classists need to keep up. Regional accents give stories more character and authenticity. I was watching a Scottish film recommended to me by a friend who is Scottish. The film's called Ned's, and it was so refreshing to just listen to characters that are authentically representing this story from this region in this time period, because that film was also a period piece. Ned's also had the added bonus of casting actors that were mostly not well established, so they don't have a bunch of work done to their faces, so they actually look like people instead of looking like actors. It was very refreshing.
She's allergic to shellfish. So if she eats scallops, then a whole mouth gets dead fat and swells up.
Yes, we've gone on many tangents now, but this is genuinely where my mind goes when I think about how devoid of authenticity those not from Yorkshire accents are. I know mine is terrible, but I've never been there. It breaks my immersion, and I can already guess from my past experience of watching any number of films with questionable accent work that I will have to get further into the film's runtime before my brain is able to adjust somewhat to be able to accept, look, this is happening, you have to just go with this because they're not going to stop what they're doing.
I can follow you like a dog to the end of the world.
It doesn't even sound like that generic British accent that British actors do when they're doing period pieces that are set not only in England, but in France or in Germany or in Italy, but somehow we're just defaulting to the actors just being British and sounding British. I watched Da Vinci's Demons. I watched The Musketeers. The list goes on and on. We should probably also address this other poster. Of course, as soon as I saw it, I went, really? You're referencing Gone with the Wind? For those who aren't familiar, the film has a major presence in film history for how commercially and critically successful it was. But also, Gone with the Wind is a story about people in the South in the US being really upset about losing their plantation way of life. I gave you a moment to let that sink in case you're someone who hasn't seen the film or read the book yet. Now, it's a well-made film, but it's also very much a product of its time.
You having an unnatural allegiance to losers.
Maybe they think that it's worth referencing in the marketing because it's also got a messy romance that is highly intertwined with economic insecurity, but considering how the instant this new Wuthering Heights film was announced a year ago, people were complaining that it's really racist to continue to whitewash Heathcliff in the 2020s. I'm just saying it's an odd choice to homage the story about the plantation owners who are very upset about losing their way of life. Is this rage bait marketing? Do you just genuinely not care? I'm not making accusations either way. I genuinely don't know what the intention was.
I saw that going differently in my mind.
I will simply call it a choice that was made. And I will move on to the next point, which is the salaciousness. There is a clear shift of trying to make the story into a salacious one, which, again, I find odd because I never got that vibe from the book. The book is just nonstop cruelty and hot tempers and vengeance and misery.
And music and movies.
Now, to be clear, I have no objections to art being salacious. I find it off-putting how much more puritanical a lot of the mainstream theatrical output of Hollywood has become in the last decade or so. But it's just an odd thing to apply to Wuthering Heights, particularly when it's set in its original time period. There have also been reports coming from an early test screening that if true, suggest a similar approach to injecting nonsensical stunts that are outrageous for the sake of it, but I don't find particularly interesting, just as it was for Saltburn. Now, I use the word suggest because ultimately, whatever speculations I might make based on a very small glimpse of the film do not mean that I know exactly what the film is in its entirety. This has happened to me before, where a film had a bad teaser trailer, but then when I watched the film in full, I liked it. But nonetheless, I couldn't help but think about that one review of Saltburn that dragged the film as being what you get when you reverse engineer shock for the most sexless generation of TikTokers and meticulously, disingenuously manufactured for faux outrage and gasps from the youngest, most easily offended cohort of new Puritans, which I found to be very funny. Because I do think it's weird how American culture has boomeranged so far backwards in that regard. And also, I've already seen Saltburn, and I have an AO3 account. There is nothing in this Wuthering Heights teaser that shocks or surprises me. It's only a teaser, but at this point it's just superficial salacious aesthetics. Of course, I will reserve my full judgment until I watch the film in its entirety, but salacious aesthetics are not inherently interesting on their own. You're not showing me anything compelling in this teaser in the way of narrative, themes, or character material. And one of the earlier controversies, maybe this was more of a niche one, was the wedding dress that Margot Robbie was photographed wearing. Some folks were complaining that it wasn't period accurate. Personally, I don't really care about that because I'm fine with anachronistic art if it's overall enjoyable to watch and if you can convince me of why it doesn't need to be period accurate in this or that way. And I also think it's completely fine for people to be upset about the lack of historical accuracy. And I really like that fashion historians get to use projects like these to talk about a piece of history. Getting more people interested in and excited about history is a good thing. Write your pieces and create your video essays nitpicking the clothing. Absolutely go for it. I'm not being sarcastic. I genuinely want those people to make those things. To elaborate a bit more on my view of anachronistic art, I don't have strict rules about when and where it's acceptable or not to be anachronistic in a period piece. It really varies from one story to the next. A Knight's Tale is a period piece, but they're playing rock songs in there. Why? Just because vibes, I suppose, and it's fun, we enjoy it. I am also biased though, I really like Heath Ledger. Probably good for me to mention that since I've been nitpicking some Australians quite a bit in this video, and I don't want any Australians in the audience to feel unwelcome, and that is my segue to talk about the absolute icon of anachronistic art, which is of course, the iconic Australian Baz Luhrmann. If you are a professional film critic and you consistently give his films bad reviews when they're first released, only to bandwagon on the hype train years after the fact, I don't trust your takes. I don't, because the girls who get it, get it. Baz Luhrmann has been doing it for the girls since the 1990s, and we love him for that. I'm going to give one example of Baz Luhrmann's approach to anachronistic storytelling. He did a film adaptation of the F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, The Great Gatsby, and in that soundtrack that you hear playing in the film, in scenes of characters living their lives in the roaring 1920s, you hear music from the likes of Jay-Z, Lana Del Rey, Florence and the Machine, Fergie. And Baz Luhrmann explained this like so. The question for me in approaching Gatsby was how to elicit from our audience the same level of excitement and pop cultural immediacy toward the world that Fitzgerald did for his audience, Luhrmann said in a statement. And in our age, the energy of jazz is caught in the energy of hip-hop. And then when Baz Luhrmann did the Elvis biopic, which was my favorite film of that year, we saw a similar approach.
You call it ghetto, but I call it wonderful. Do what they say, but I do what I want to do.
Why did Baz Luhrmann infuse the film with modern artists and hip-hop beats? Per the director, it was a way of illustrating the radical impact of Presley's sound on audiences, a technique he honed on 2013's The Great Gatsby. When I went to do Gatsby, Fitzgerald wrote African-American street music, jazz numbers, into the novel, the director explains. He coined the term jazz age. Jay-Z and I realized that the translation of jazz must be hip-hop. We were translating not only what it was, but what it felt like. To audiences of today, Elvis Presley might seem like a relic of a bygone era, a guy with an oft-imitated voice, flashy jumpsuits, and a cadre of hokey movies to his credit. But what Luhrmann and Butler wanted audiences to appreciate was just how dangerous Presley seemed when he first rose to fame. Baz Luhrmann's approach to the music and artists that are anachronistic compared to the setting of those particular scenes and the overall stories of these films is a means of bridging the gap between the source material, the history, past time periods, to the here and now. And in particular, this strategy is why every time he releases a new film, the youth of that era are the demographic who are the fastest to embrace it. Thus, in theory, anachronism could be a means of translating the story of Wuthering Heights and the rebellious, provocative, shocking qualities it had relative to the time it was originally released to an audience of today. Whether or not Emerald Fennell's vision will resonate with me specifically remains to be seen, regardless of some of the skepticism I've expressed in this video. Currently, I don't walk into films at the cinema hoping that they're horrible. If I'm taking the time to go see them, I am hoping that they're going to win me over in some way, even if I don't necessarily have the highest expectations going in. If I feel very strongly that a film has no chance of winning me over, I'm probably just going to skip it entirely. That's time I could be spending watching other films that have already been out for however many years or decades that I haven't seen yet or I haven't seen in a while and I would like to rewatch them. It's time that I could be using to read yet another book that I want to do a source material video on, or just something I'm reading because I want to. And even if I don't end up enjoying this adaptation of Wuthering Heights, if this ends up being commercially successful, which I'm already assuming that's going to be the case because of how much attention it has, and there's not much else to compete with this in the month of February, at least of what's currently listed, I really hope that that's going to provide more opportunities for other adaptations of classic literature, be they period pieces or modern adaptations. We've got Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein coming out in November, which coincidentally, Jacob Elordi is also in. I may be rightfully skeptical about him playing Heathcliff, but him as the creature, that's far more believable to me. But we all know the number one Frankenstein's monster that everyone else that has come afterwards is going to be compared to is Shuler Hensley in Stephen Sommers' Van Helsing.
You wretched undead! I shall have my revenge!
He had no business acting the hell out of that part the way that he did. Argue with the wall. So, go see Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights in February of next year, or don't. Either way, please find something to support at the cinema. By the time you see this video, I'm going to be off to the cinema to watch the theatrical re-release of James Cameron's Avatar: The Way of Water. That man has been doing it for the romance girlies for 40 years. And that's one of the reasons why I really, really like him.
One of the lessons is caveat emptor.